Welcome to Season 5 of the Photo Ethics Podcast. I'm your host, Savannah Dodd, and I'm the founder of the Photography Ethics Center. Each week, I'll be talking with an accomplished photographer about the ethics of their practice. Today, in episode number 10, we'll be talking with Daniel Etter about truth and fiction. Daniel is a Pulitzer Prize-winning photographer, feature writer, and filmmaker currently based in Berlin, Germany. He's a graduate of the German School of Journalism, holds a master's degree in political science, a university diploma in journalism, and received the Catherine Davis Fellowship for Peace. His photography has appeared in the New York Times, Time Magazine, Newsweek, and in publications of the International Committee of the Red Cross and Human Rights Watch, among many others. In 2016, he was awarded with the Pulitzer Prize and the John Faber Award of the Overseas Press Club of America. He received third place in the World Press Photo Award and various awards at Pictures of the Year International. His photo from the Gezi Park protests in Istanbul was chosen as one of the best photos of 2013 by Time Magazine and the New York Times. He's also won awards for his writing, and he is an ambitious gardener. Can we start with you just telling us a little bit about the kind of work that you do?
I do a lot of things. For the past 14 years or so, I've been working as a photojournalist mainly, but I also write and I do make movies. And I have done a lot of work on conflicts, crisis, and climate change recently. But it's all kinds of things. It's very varied. So I do a lot of things that just interest me. And sometimes I do things that can't really be put into photography. Some things can't be put into writing. So it kind of depends. But I'm just very curious in general.
How do you make that decision about, what can be told through photography and what can't be told through photography? And maybe what are the different ways that you approach those different processes, especially thinking in terms of ethics?
It's the differentiation between like the stories you can do in photography and those you can do in writing or movies. It's just like inherent in the stories itself. Some things are just not very visual and other things are very visual, and sometimes it comes together and then you can make a movie out of them. Movies then really depend on good characters. So you have to have a good character, you have to have character development. If you see potential for that, you can make a movie out of stories. But sometimes I am quite interested in science and certain scientific topics. And there it's quite difficult for the kind of photography I do to be put to use in most cases. Even when I do scientific stories, it's all about like the human level on which they play out rather than the like actual scientific level. But there's science behind it, and sometimes you have amazing photos to go with that, and sometimes you do not. So it's like inherent in the story. There's not really like a discussion about it. It's either it is visual or it is not visual, and it's just like whatever sparks my interest.
And I guess I've spoken with a few people who've moved from photography into filmmaking, and it seems like there can be quite a lot of difference in approaches to ethics between the different mediums. Have you found that, or what kinds of differences have you encountered?
Well, photojournalism is very puristic, I'd say. So my approach has always been to only photograph what happens in front of me without telling people what to do. And that's like what most of my colleagues do, I suppose. And with like some exceptions when you take portraits or whatever. But like in most cases, you just like, you hunt for the moment that is what makes it exciting. With filmmaking, it's a much more complex process. So you really need scenes to play out in front of the camera. And like sometimes you have them occurring naturally. And sometimes you have to, give them a little push and kind of create scenes. It doesn't mean that you tell people what to say or you tell people what to do, but, you say, maybe let's go for a picnic or whatever, like just to create scenarios and scenes where things can happen, because at the end you have to have a movie or like the material to tell a story, and to tell that story in as many like scenes as possible without people sitting in front of the camera and like telling what's happening, but like things actually happening. There's like a bit more flexibility, I think, in terms of how you can direct. I mean, like also with documentaries, you're the director in the end. And I think there's like still a clear ethical line which you shouldn't like push, but sometimes you have to like, create the environment where things are happening. I recently shot a documentary on rescue divers in Iraq, of all places. And of course, you're not going to fake a rescue mission. These are all things that are happening naturally and without us interfering. But there's like, maybe we have a character go to the market or something, and and then like see what happens, what they do there. Because otherwise, with a lot of documentaries, it's quite costly because you have bigger teams, you need more time, you need the equipment, you need the post-production, which includes translations and everything. So you have to be able to manage all that within a week or so, or 10 days for like TV features. And there you really have to think what you're going to film, what you want out of it, why you're filming that, what it's going to tell. And then sometimes, you have to push people a little bit, or start a conversation and then let it play out in front of the camera.
That's really interesting, I think, an interesting point about, the production of it and how much that influences the process. And I guess it made me think, you're talking about like different lines as well that, you wouldn't push beyond when you're doing a film. And I guess in my head, I'm wondering, when you are trying to maybe instigate scenes or suggest things to push the story along, would you always keep it within the confines of what someone would do naturally? So, for example, you suggest going to the market because they go to the market once a month anyway, but you really need it to happen during this week. Or would there be times where you would suggest something that is not naturally occurring? Does that make sense?
Yeah, basically that's it. So you wouldn't then it feels unnatural because it is unnatural. You can't like force people to do things they don't do by themselves if they're not actors. Normally it doesn't really work. So yeah, like you need to have things occur naturally, and then like maybe like have them like do them on another day and things like that. So yeah, it's not doing things they wouldn't do otherwise.
Absolutely. And I guess that requires a fair bit of cultural awareness and understanding of the context that you're working in as well, to know what is relevant or natural or naturally occurring, and to work within that.
I mean, like, you have to talk to people and you have to be able to understand the story. So it's quite clear. And people you ask people before, like, what's your schedule? What do you normally do? What does your job involve? Or maybe you're following one character and they're not working on that the week you're there, so you're asking them to come that week instead of like another week. So it's not having them do anything they wouldn't normally do otherwise.
I guess now as well, we've got another medium of image making that's really coming into the forefront, right? With AI image generation. And I know that you were involved in an open letter that was written to that effect. And I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about that and about how you see the role of maybe AI image generation.
AI generated images, as they are now, basically are accumulating existing images and mashing them up. So effectively, it's large-scale copyright infringement on like an industrial scale or like a digital industrial scale. And the thing what makes our work valuable is not, taking an image. It is being there and reporting, being on the ground, reporting things as they happen in front of the camera, and not like how a computer imagines it. So it is, I think the whole AI thing, as we're seeing now, there's so much money being pushed into it and like pushed up on us without us really needing it or needing to use it, that I think that is problematic. But like in terms of photojournalism, it's really for the past year or so, we have seen AI images even crop up on like stock photography sites where they're posing as like depictions of actual events, which is incredibly harmful. And like with a lot of tech innovations we have seen in recent years, nobody thinks about the outcome. Nobody thinks about the possible consequences of what they're doing. It's just like an arms race to be faster and bigger and more disruptive, as they say. And nobody really thinks about what you're disrupting and what the consequences can be. It's just like that is left to other institutions, to lawmakers or whatever. But now you have like these gigantic corporations, sometimes ruled by men, single men, who alone can decide what is shown and what can be seen and what can be produced. And I think it is really incredibly harmful to not only our industry and my profession, but to democracy itself, because everything, we can only have a functioning society if we agree that certain facts are facts and not fiction. And you already see, which I think has always been around, but has been accelerated by social media, the prevalence of conspiracy theories in recent years, and just like insane conspiracy theories. And like everyone I know has somebody in their vicinity, some like the uncle or the brother or whoever, who believes in really outlandish theories, be it about climate change, be it about COVID or whatever. And what you hear when you talk to people who believe in these things, they are like, always when they're cornered, they say like, oh, you can't know that. And in fact, you can know a lot of things. And with the prevalence of AI images, makes it harder to say definitely that you can know things, that you can say like an image is most likely a depiction of an actual event. So yes, it is a big threat, not only to our industry, but like, yeah, as I said, like to democracy and a functioning society.
Absolutely. I mean, I guess in a context where truth was becoming increasingly slippery, AI generated images do accelerate that slipperiness of truth and fact in a way that's hard to backpedal. And I guess, how do we backpedal that? Or how do we reharness the capacity for photography to shed light on something in a way that maybe not is true, but can be trusted?
I have no idea, to be honest. It's incredibly hard. And like, I think it's much deeper if you really think about it. Why do people believe in outlandish theories? Why do people not take anything for truth anymore? Often these are people who are like, struggling in their real lives, struggling in their relationships, having like lost their jobs or whatever. That's kind of the common denominator. So the basis for all this is a functioning society, starting with good education system, a good social security system where people are not being left alone. And then I think if people feel safe and secure, it's easier to approach them, and to gain their trust or to keep their trust. But it's incredibly hard, of course, because, like when I grew up, we had a single newspaper everybody read in our hometown. So everybody could agree what they talked about, what they're going to talk about the next day, what the big issues are. And it was never perfect. And it was like gate kept by certain people, journalists and editors. But there was the common denominator was much bigger, or there was one that was shared by more people than it is now with, social media and Telegram and WhatsApp groups and your neighbors. And then you're struggling with inflation and I don't know, you have 3 kids at home and like people across from you seem to have it easier and you're seeking for an explanation and you can't really find it easily. But there's all these people who tell you untruth or conspiracy theories that are spreading propaganda, and you start to believe them because it's an easy narrative that can be easily digested and can be personalized, can be focused on a group or, well, on others mostly. And yeah, so that is really difficult, and I don't think it can come out of photography or journalism itself. It has to be society-wide effort to generate trust, like good critical trust in authorities where it's due. It doesn't mean that you have to believe everything and that you have to like follow like they say like sheep, but you have to like have critical thinking skills and like certain trust in authorities that goes to a certain degree. And yeah, as I said, like it doesn't really come out of photography itself. It comes from a wider societal context.
I think that's a really good point that, the issues that maybe we're facing as an industry are actually part of a systemic issue, and it's part of a much bigger problem.
As journalists, we only have a certain amount of tools at our hand. That is reporting, that is truthful reporting, that is, we all have biases, like there's no unbiased reporting. Whoever tells you that normally has a very certain bias themselves. But, you have to have truthful reporting. You have to be sure you get the facts right. You have to be sure not to, like, even if I take images, I can manipulate by framing a certain way or showing things or don't showing things. So you have to be sure about that. Journalism is an integral part of democracy. So democratic values are the basis of my work. So I am biased towards those. Biased not only to, people voting, but having minority rights and constitutional systems and a rule of law and these things. So I have to be biased towards those because the very existence of my profession relies on that. And yeah, so there has to be like a certain kind of standpoint, I'd say is probably the right word. And you have to be sure of that. You have to communicate that. And you have to like say, hey, we're reporting facts, but we view them from a certain direction. And so like these are like the tools we have as journalists, but they're limited. We can't do more, but we're like have to like be as close to certain ideals of journalism as possible, but we can't do more, and that's limited. And like just by reporting facts, we have seen doesn't really convince people. So it's like a deeper process that goes way deeper into society than what we can offer, and it starts earlier. Like in Germany, we have a big divide between like the West and the East, and after like more than 30 years of unification, still people in the East, they earn less, they're less healthy, they have worse schools. In the kindergartens, there's less kindergarteners in relation to kids, and all these things. And like they're like frustrated, of course, because like there's a systemic issue. And instead of like addressing that systemic issue, they focus on like others are to blame, or certain parties blame others, be it foreigners, be it like people who live in cities or environmentalists or whatever. They are to blame and it's their fault, and the anger goes there. And then you see them from that viewpoint, you see the media as conspiring with these forces, with these others. But the root cause is nothing we can address as journalists. We can report on these things. We can say like, there's an issue that needs to be resolved. But ultimately, it's a systemic issue that the state has to solve to some degree, be it by, like just the pensions. In the eastern part of the country, they are lower than in the western part of the country. That does not make any sense after 30 years later. Just like it's a political decision you can do within, I guess, a couple of months. You could change that, but it's not happening. So yeah, that is my very long answer to what we can do.
This conversation or this idea of sort of the limits of objectivity in reporting reminds me of something that I think you posted to Instagram not that long ago about like how a photograph isn't truth. And I was wondering if you could maybe speak to that a little bit.
So this was a photo I took last year in Somalia, and it shows, we have certain stereotypes of Somalia, internally displaced people, living in tents, living in dire conditions, and visually is often reflected in like, women crying or like covering their faces, looking really sad, basically. But the reality, of course, is more complex, and it doesn't really. So you have often it's a very joyful place to some extent. Like there's a lot of kids that run around, that play. So there's a certain joyfulness often. The photo I took was of a woman in a Somali IDP camp who was eating a popsicle, a red popsicle. And it's very bright and it's close-up portrait, so you don't really see the context. And it is not the image you would want to use to illustrate conditions in the camp because it's misleading. But it's still like a truthful photo. It's nothing I have staged. It's just like somebody gave out ice cream or popsicles. I don't know why. I haven't asked for that to happen. It just happened in front of the camera, and it was a very striking photo because like the popsicle was red and the woman was wearing a green headscarf, so it really popped out. And this is a true photo, but it doesn't really encapsulate the conditions in these camps. So it's more like you sometimes have to rely on stereotypes to be able to tell a story. And sometimes you have to look really closely and understand what you're seeing there, because you break the stereotype and it leads you to a place which is not right, or which leads you to wrong conclusions. Because I can easily see like somebody saying like, oh, they're doing fine, they're eating popsicles, which doesn't really make sense. But we have seen the same with, refugees having cell phones. Doesn't really tell us anything about anything else but the fact that they have cell phones, which is kind of crucial in today's world. But it doesn't tell you anything else. And yeah, what I wanted to say, or what like the idea was that you see a joyful moment. It's a true moment, but it's not depicting the reality of the wider context.
I think that's a really interesting point that you make about stereotypes as well, because obviously stereotypes can be incredibly harmful when we perpetuate certain stereotypes and we come to think of maybe a whole community or a whole region as looking a certain way or being a certain thing. But at the same time, I think that you make a point that there's truth in stereotypes as well. There is deprivation in Somalia, and there are incredible challenges. And so to show joyous moments might break that stereotype, but might be counterproductive. Am I understanding that correctly?
No, it's not counterproductive. I don't think so.
No.
But it can be. It's just like a matter of how fast you want to communicate and how easy you want an image to be read. It can also it's not a judgment per se, because you can use it both ways in order to get somebody's attention. Or in a news article, you probably wouldn't use the photo, but if you write a longer story where people actually take the time to sit down and read, that might be a different thing. So it's not counterproductive per se. It depends on the context where you use it. And if you get attention, I think it's always good. It's not always good, but getting attention is the first thing to communicate about things in the world, and it's just guiding that attention in the right direction. That is the important part of it.
No, that makes a lot of sense. That's a helpful clarification. Thank you. And is there anything else about photography or photography ethics that you would want to debunk? I'm thinking a lot about these ideas of truth or fiction or objectivity. And I know that you're somebody who thinks about these things a lot. So I thought that maybe you might have other ideas of things that need to be debunked.
I mean, like, first of all, like most of the images you see in legacy media will not be manipulated beyond like the photographer framing them in a certain way. All my colleagues most of my colleagues work to very high ethical standards. So, and I think there is a misconception that there's more manipulation and more photoshopping and more AI than there actually is. That is the misconception. And then the other thing is just like we all have a motivation why we do that job, and it's not like to mislead people. It's to be there, to report, to take photographs. It's like it's very exciting. It's like, as I said, like it's hunting for images because you wait for the right moment, and then when you have it, it's a very satisfying moment. So like there's no joy in manipulation, and like it's not as widespread as people think that it is. Yeah, and there's like I mean, like if you look at Reuters and the newswires especially, they have very strict standards because they have learned from past mistakes, past oversights where they had trust in people and it wasn't justified. So they have checks in place in order to avoid manipulation. And also, you have to understand if you make a career out of it and you're caught, your career is normally over. And sometimes when I tell people who are not into photojournalism, who don't know about it, when I tell people why people have lost their jobs, they are quite incredulous because it seems like a minor infraction. It seems like that is something that happens all the time, but it actually does not happen all the time because there's very strict standards. If you photograph for the New York Times or Reuters or AP, you sign a very comprehensive ethics contract as well. So you're bound by that. And it's not perfect. People are human and people sometimes go down paths they shouldn't, but normally means they lose their jobs and their reputation. So that is worthy of consideration. Yeah, and the other misconception is like that tech will come in and displace all these jobs, which I think is just bullshit, to be honest, because, like ChatGPT or Midjourney, they do generate images, but are not based on real. I mean, they're based on real events, but they're just mashups, and they're not very constructive and not very creative in what they do, and it cannot replace what we do because it's original. It doesn't really come from an existing place. Like it doesn't really come from Wikipedia or Reddit or Google Images or Instagram. Like it's happening now or it's going to happen in the future, and we're going to report on that. So it can never be replaced by AI. And if you put too much trust into that and too much hope into technology, I think that is leading us down a very destructive path.
Yeah, and you mentioned something there that made me want to ask a little bit about your own past experience as well. Like, I wonder if you could maybe think back to a time that you encountered an ethical dilemma, or maybe just describe the types of ethical dilemmas that you most often encounter in your work, and how do you navigate them, and how have you learned how to navigate them as well?
What's an ethical dilemma? It's like it's between publishing and not publishing. What happens when you publish? What happens when you don't publish? What happens when you take a photo versus you don't? Like much of it happens in the moment. Much of it happens right there and right then. that's like taken photos. I was once, a long time ago, 10 years ago, I think, I was in Libya after Gaddafi fell, and rebels, or whatever you want to call them, took control of Tripolis, and we came across a hospital that was abandoned, and the patients, many of them, I don't really know if they're patients, to be honest, but many people in there, many dead bodies. It was full of bodies, basically, and many of them were tied with zip ties and tied to the beds and in early stages of decomposition. And we went there, and it was such a gruesome scene that I didn't really see the point of photographing there. But sometimes, I mean, and this was like before everybody filmed everything, everybody photographed everything. So we were there as like the first people who were actually documenting what was happening there. And for me, it was just too gruesome to send and to file. So I didn't really take any pictures. And later, people tried to find out what happened there, and I didn't have any material. So it's like, sometimes you have the obligation to document because you're in a place like this, and it might help later point, even if you can't publish these images, because nobody's going to print heavily decomposed bodies. So yeah, that was a learning experience, I suppose, in terms of ethical dilemmas. And so, like, as I said, like, much of it happens in the moment. So I'd rather photograph more and think about it later, because then you have time to decide what you're going to publish and what you're not going to publish, what are you going to show and what not, and see like different standards apply. So, you know, like in terms of showing like dead bodies, it's like there's definitely different standards in the media when they're like black or brown or white bodies. So does it apply to you? And you have to think about that. There's also different standards. These standards are not only coming from us. Sometimes there's just like culturally different standards, that like death is more openly displayed than in the West, some cultures. So kind of adopting that and seeing how far you can go without having double standards.
Yeah, there's a really interesting article by Sarah Centillis about that, which I can link to in the show notes. That I think it's a really good description and a really good sort of unpacking of that double standard. The final question that I like to ask everyone on the podcast is, what does photography ethics mean to you?
No, it's very simple. Just being respectful and meeting people at eye level and being open to their experience and being open to their grief and seeing what causes less or more harm to them. So it's just like respecting people. It's like, as I said before, like, do you want to show a dead boy and the grieving father or not? And in some cases, you know, if it was like somebody who was killed on the road in an accident here, you'd probably say, no, it doesn't really make any sense. But maybe the father says like, yeah, show that, because I want people to see. Maybe it's somebody even here, but like, we have to understand people and like see if it's justifiable to show certain things or not show certain things. And it comes down to respecting everybody equally.
Thank you very much for listening to this episode of the Photo Ethics Podcast. The aim of this podcast is to share new insights about photography ethics with others. So if you heard something you liked, please share this podcast with someone who would appreciate it. You can also rate and review us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Join me next week when we hear from Mohammed Al-Nubani on reducing bias in imagery. In each episode of the podcast, we ask our guests, what does photography ethics mean to you? This is a question that everyone in the photography industry should be able to answer. That's why the Photography Ethics Center is asking you, our listeners, to commit to writing and publishing your own statement of ethics. Visit www.photoethics.org/ethics to learn more and to take the pledge committing to ethical transparency, accountability, and awareness. That's www.photoethics.org/ethics.